All right, welcome back, Trinity teens, as we continue through John chapter 6. And today we'll only be covering 5 verses, so that'll be verses 36 through verse 40. As usual, I'm going to have you read a little bit of a larger portion, the surrounding verses, to think in the context of the passage here. So hopefully you've been following along. And as we looked at yesterday, remember that Jesus he's trying to explain himself to the people, trying to give them truth. And so the segment yesterday, we talked about Jesus is the bread of life. And that's what he's been telling them. And that's what he's going to continue to tell them, as you'll see in later on in the chapter, later on in this conversation. But again, we're just covering a small segment here. So Jesus has told them, I am the bread of life. I am sustenance. I am satisfaction, not just for here on earth, but for eternity. So at this point, I do want you to pause. I want you to read verses 30 down through verse 40. All right? So starting in verse 30, and then read all the way down through verse 40. Jesus' point here, in this little section that we're looking at today, is not just that he is the bread of life. He goes a little bit farther, and in this section here, kind of the overall thought that I want you to have in your mind here, the point that Jesus is trying to make is that not only is he the bread of life, but that he is God the Father's perfect plan for mankind. So actually, let's start in verse 35 and then read into verse 36. Jesus said unto them, I am the bread of life. He that comes to me shall never hunger, and he that believes on me shall never thirst. But I said unto you, that ye also have seen me, and believe not. So Jesus makes this statement here, and this is important, because he says, you've seen me, you've seen the miracles that I've been doing, you've heard the teaching that I'm giving to you, and you still don't believe. And they've seen him for a chunk of time now. They have had all the evidence right in front of them, and they still don't believe. I think Jesus says this because it's connected to the next thing that he says in verse 37. All right, what does Jesus mean in verse 37? Actually, I would ask you to pause now and read that verse. Read verse 37. What does Jesus mean in verse 37? Here's what I would submit to you. Connected to verse 36, what Jesus says in verse 37 is, all that the Father gives me shall come to me, and him that comes to me I will in no wise cast out. So Jesus is saying, you don't believe even though you've seen, but God is not going to reject anyone who does believe. God won't reject anyone who believes. All that the Father gives me shall come to me, and him that comes to me I will in no wise cast out. So think about this. God's saying you don't believe, but the opportunity to believe is always there. The opportunity to believe is always there. The opportunity to come to Christ is always open. Now, Jesus, in these last couple of verses that we'll look at today, just verses 38 through verse 40, Jesus is going to go into, not only is he the bread of life, but his purpose is perfectly lined up with God's purpose. Look at verse 38. He says, for I came down from heaven, not to do mine own will, but the will of him that sent me. So Jesus' purpose was God's purpose. What is God's purpose? Jesus explains it in verse 39 through verse 40. It says, and this is the Father's will which hath sent me, that of all which he hath given me I should lose nothing, but should raise it up again at the last day. And this is the will of him that sent me, that every one which sees the Son and believes on him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day. So what is God's purpose? What is the Father's purpose? What's the Father's will? In verse 39, verse 40, it's this: for Jesus to perfectly save mankind, for Jesus to be salvation for man. Verse 39, and this is the Father's will which hath sent me, that of all which he hath given me, I should lose nothing, but should raise it up again at the last day. What else? What's the other aspect of God's will? Verse 40, and this is the will of him that sent me, that everyone which sees the Son and believes on him may have everlasting life. So for Jesus to save, and for Jesus to in that give life for anyone that will believe. So again, I connect this back to what he says earlier, that even though these people right now, they are not believing him right now, they can choose to believe him. They can change their minds. They can place their trust in him. Anyone can do that at any time. Anyone can come to Jesus. I want you to notice something here, and maybe you've already picked up on this. In both verse 39 and in verse 40, he repeats himself there. At the end of verse 39, he says that God's will is that I should lose nothing, but should raise it up again at the last day. And then the end of verse 40, anyone can believe on the Son and can have everlasting life. And then the end of verse 40, and I will raise him up at the last day. Here again, I want you to pause and I want you to think about this question. Why does Jesus bring up the resurrection here? Meaning the resurrection of our souls from here on earth to live with God in heaven. Why does Jesus bring that up here? Pause and think about that. Here's what I would submit to you. This is why Jesus brings up this aspect of the resurrection several times in here. Because Jesus being God's plan, Jesus is God's perfect plan for mankind. That includes not just our life here on earth, but eternity with God. Because eternity is the end of God's plan, or the culminating of God's plan. You know, when we're in a bad situation, or going through a rough spot, it's kind of applicable to right now, isn't it? When you're going through a hard time, you tend to want to look towards the end of it. When's this hard time going to be over? And I just had this conversation with someone just within the last couple of hours. They said, man, I'll be glad when this is all over, is what they said to me. And meaning, you know, when life can kind of go back to normal in some regard. But we like to know the end, or find out when the end is coming. And oftentimes we have no idea. We don't know when we're going to enter a hard time, and we don't know when that hard time is then going to be over with, be done. We don't know. Isn't it comforting that Jesus, that God, has everything planned out to the end? Not just in a hard situation or crisis, but in the scope of eternity, in the scope of our lives, our eternal lives, in our souls. Jesus isn't just talking about life on earth here. He's talking about eternity. He's talking about forever and ever, that God has that planned out. That God's plan for man started before creation. If you think back to our study in Ephesians chapter 1, Paul talks about that God's plan started before creation, before he made the foundation of the world. That's why in Genesis chapter 1, when God says, let us make man in our image, that implies the forethought that was before there. God's plan started before the world was formed, and God's plan is planned out all the way to the end, when our world is no more, and all it is either separation from God or eternity with God. Isn't it comforting that God has everything planned out to the end? I hope that is an encouragement for you today, and maybe a challenge too, to live in light of that fact and to rest in that fact of God's plan for us. So in the last segment, Jesus is the bread of life. In this segment, Jesus is God's plan for man. In the next segment, we'll talk about the fact that Jesus is man's only solution. So hope you tune back in for that. Thanks for watching. We're praying for you guys. We miss you guys. I hope that doesn't sound cheesy because it's actually very true. So thanks for watching, and I hope we get to see you soon.